I don't come as an expert in democracy. I'm not sure there are experts in democracy. But I do come as someone for whom it has been a passion for my entire life. And I have pursued that as a civil rights worker. I have pursued that as a student organizer. I pursued it as a prisoner. I pursued it as a journalist, a commentator. I pursued it as a political candidate. And I think it is sacred. And it is in danger of being lost in many ways. And not necessarily from the day-to-day, but from a larger point of view as we examine the dynamics that are at play in the democracy. There is some stuff down the line that could be, could spell the end of what we have inherited. So probably the day after the election is a good time to have that conversation with ourselves, now that we've gotten the immediate business out of the way. And of course, we as Americans take great pride in our elections. Our capacity to peacefully change power through the ballot box has been something that we all have stood with great pride and pointed at as characteristic of our democracy. And certainly the vote is one of our cherished inheritances, which I think we sometimes forget. My first involvement with an election was at the age of 18 in the state of Mississippi, where myself and 3 other civil rights workers were standing in the middle of a little town called Lambert, Mississippi. And we had just come back from the black side of town, where we were trying to register people to vote in the upcoming Mississippi election. And the 3 other people I was with decided to go to the post office, left me standing there by the car, waiting for them to come back. No sooner had they left than up pulled a pickup truck with 2 white guys in it. They both got out. One had a shotgun, the other one had a pistol. And the guy with the shotgun stuck it about that far from my face and said, "Nigger lover, I'm giving you 5 minutes to get out of town before I blow your head off." Now, I was a Stanford student, 18 years old, so I immediately started the palaver of, well, who are you to tell women, what do you mean? Talking about? What authority do you act under? You know, and he waggles his gun and says, "Nigger lover," I said 5 minutes. Well, about that time, the other 3 came back. We all jumped in the car, and we survived Lambert, Mississippi. But the vote stands as a thing of value to me, having stood there in places like Lambert, Mississippi, and tried to make that vote happen. In the Quitman County, Mississippi, where I was, one of the iconic figures in the local civil rights movement was a woman who, at the age of 70, had walked into the registrar of voters office, stepped up to the counter and said, "I want to register to vote." She was immediately arrested, thrown in the local jail, tortured with an electric cattle prod while she was in the jail. Then they let her loose. She walked out of the jail, walked back down the street to the registrar of voters office, walked in and said, "I want to register to vote." So, as we approach our elections, we should remember how much struggle there was to get everybody included in it, which makes the apathy displayed by our nation yesterday all the more of a betrayal to what our inheritance is. You know, that we don't value our capacity to vote enough to exercise that right should shame us in the eyes of all those people who sacrificed so much that they could partake of elections just like everybody else. That said, democracy is a lot more than voting. And, you know, democracy is not really a noun, although it looks like that on election day, but it's really a verb. It is a living organism that is constantly growing and changing and expressing itself. And for democracy to really function, it has to have a culture that supports that. It is that larger set of assumptions and beliefs and visions that we bring to our democracy that make it work. We have seen around the world as first-timers in elections have tried to make democracy work and stumble over their own cultures, which couldn't bring the right values to the process in order to make it stick. And so it's with an eye to those dynamics that I want to talk today. Because I've identified 7 such dynamics which are sitting out there in our future with enormous consequences. The first of those is that our representative process as a nation is corrupt. I mean corrupt in the most venal sense of corrupt. We as Americans, of course, do not accept that about ourselves. But you will notice in the last election, the single greatest determining factor in the outcome of most of those elections was the presence of money. We also notice that in Washington, D.C., when the Congress meets and considers significant issues, there is always money changing hands as part of that process. The people who receive the money eventually retire and become the people who hand it out to their successors. And that dominance of money over our political process is anything but democratic. And if we're serious about continuing as a democracy, some way we have to come to grips with that corruption. And it is corruption, and we should talk about it by that name. Calling it lobbying does not change the fact that it's a remnant from some banana republic. If we're going to be serious about being democratic, then it can't be for sale. The second dynamic that scares me is that we, as a nation, have become addicted to imposing our will around the world. We spend more on military hardware than all the rest of the countries in the world combined. And we use that to dictate the terms that people halfway around the world from us are going to live under. Empire and democracy don't mix. And empire has been an extraordinary failure by all accounts. We have only gotten in deeper the more we've thrashed around it. And the sooner we can step back from that, the better chance we have of surviving as a democracy. It is no secret that that empire raises the worst parts of our democracy to it. All those forces that make it less possible for citizens to control their government come to a head and when it comes to the military budget and the use of that military around the world. And we've got to rein ourselves in. We, of course, have been proud as a nation of our exceptionalism. And we make a big point about that America is an exceptional place. And that exceptionalism has been transformed as we've sent our armies around the world into arrogance. Our belief that somehow we as Americans can do the same thing as all the people that we identify as bad guys, and somehow it becomes different because we as Americans have done it. And we've been trying to learn that sad lesson over and over and over again. You don't get what you call it, you don't get your authorship. What you get is what you do. And if we behave out there like the people that supposedly we distinguish ourselves from, then we're going to be just like them. And that can't bid well for us. The third is that somehow in our cultural process, we seem to have lost track of reality. Maybe this is the impact of advertising on our culture. But we seem to have competing versions of hopeless fantasies on all sides, as though everything in the world is spin. Everything isn't spin. And a democracy can't function unless there is the shared notion that there is such a thing as reality, that it is discoverable by human beings, that there is a truth out there, that that truth is reached by examining evidence and talking back and forth about it, and ultimately coming to that conclusion. But if there is no shared notion that there is such a thing as reality, then it's just a room full of people, and the person who shouts loudest wins. And as we try and figure out how it is the partisanship of Washington got so far out of hand, this is an essential piece of that puzzle. There is reality, and we're going to have to discover it, and discover it in common, and each of us give up our sacred cows when the evidence contradicts it. Democracy can work on those terms. It can't work when everybody's first allegiance is to their ideology. First allegiance has to be to truth. Fourth dynamic that scares me is our hysteria. Certainly, the recent rise of Ebola in Western Africa gives us classic examples of how the machinery of our culture has become increasingly hysterical. We saw perhaps the prime example of that after the attacks on 9/11, where the entire nation watched the same video loop over and over and over and over and over, and convinced itself that somehow out of that we should abandon the Bill of Rights, we should send an army halfway around the world that is still there fighting to this day, and we should be governed by the fear that has come to occupy the top of our political food chain. This is supposed to be the home of the brave. And democracy is a risky enough proposition under any circumstance. But if every time we hit a bump in a road, everybody starts playing Chicken Little, we will never get through what's up in store for us. And I have to have the unfortunate duty of identifying that what is now called journalism has been a great player in making this happen to us. The need to generate a kind of fear that translates into fascination in order to draw markets and draw audience has led us to a situation where there is no such thing as calming down. The only thing is amping up. And if we just keep amping up, we're going to top out and find ourselves incapable of doing what we have to do. The fifth dynamic that scares me is that we as a culture have lost our attention span. From a variety of locations, we suddenly find ourselves with about a 15-second capacity. And if during those 15 seconds you can make an audience's palms sweat you can probably be President of the United States. If you can't, you can't. And we are at a point in our democracy where we need to be able to make considered decisions. We need to be able to look over the horizon. We need to bring serious attention to what is going on around us. And as long as we're trapped in that 15-second attention span, we don't stand a chance. A sixth dynamic that scares me is that we have placed an inordinate amount of faith in punishment. We have the highest per capita rate of incarceration of any country in the world. The statistics don't lie. 1 out of 4 black men in this country will spend time in jail. And we have to remember the issue here is justice, not revenge. And the notion that we can somehow punish people for being the people they are and successfully maneuver that as a democracy is a fallacy. Democracies have to redeem. They have to be able to give people second chances. Crime comes out of circumstances. If you don't address the circumstances, then the crime simply continues and continues. And our process of warehousing people, and releasing them, then turning them back in and warehousing them some more, is one of the great wastes of resources in the United States, and an incredible threat to our capacity to be able to deliver the justice that democracy promises. We don't need to put any more people in prison. We need to figure out what they need in order not to commit those crimes in the first place. Because most of them are not there for hurting anybody. And finally, the dynamic that scares me perhaps most of all is that we're at least halfway to becoming a plutocracy. The top 1% of America owns more than the bottom 70% of America. Never in our history has the distance between wealth and the rest of the society been greater. Even in the Gilded Age, which was famous for excesses, we have surpassed that. And we have created a class of citizens who essentially capture all the rewards and leave the leftovers for the rest of it. That won't work. It won't work. It's failing us as we speak. That 0.1% of America should own more than a quarter of the country is not the equality of reward and opportunity that democracies have to have. And we need to bring proportion back to our economic circumstances. We have had it at other points in our history, and we need to remember what those points were. So all those dynamics, to me, are threatening to democracy under the best of circumstances. But we should also approach this with the clear understanding that the best of circumstances is long gone. And the circumstances in which democracy is going to have to survive could not be more dire. Climate change is upon us. We're seeing the lead edges of it every day. And we haven't seen anything yet. It's going to be a time of enormous disruption. It's going to be a time when we and all peoples in the world are going to have to make do with far less than what they have had before. When populations are going to be dislocated, when Ebola and its like are going to be common occurrences. We have the science. We have the computer model. And so far, the computer model has turned out to be absolutely on the mark. And if we hope to survive as a democracy in the face of that, then it's going to have to be a new kind of rule. It's going to be all for one and one for all. Otherwise, we're going to find whole-scale abandonment of population. Poor people are going to become dispensable, and we are going to start fighting for resources around the world. And so if you didn't need enough impetus, there's that. And the bad news, of course, is that we're the only option. This is not going to be changed from on top. It's the viability of citizens taking control of their lives and their communities and their circumstances that is going to be how this changes. We can't count on our nation's leadership to do anything but follow when the people decide what they want to do. And we should also understand that the failings here are not just leadership failings. The failings are amongst us all. It is how we have chosen to be that is coming home to roost for us. And we must make a different choice than that. And at the center of that choice has to be our passion for democracy. More than ever, we need people who are devoted to that notion and who are prepared to stand up for it under all circumstances. And we may not end up being experts that way, but we may end up being able to control our future that is anything but automatically controllable. And I think all of us have to bring that passion that that woman in Quitman County, Mississippi brought when she walked into the registrar of voters office. We have to bring it about the state of our democracy and hold everybody's feet to the fire. And with that, we've got a fighting chance. So I guess we do questions at this point. Or answers. You have either a question or an answer.
So I'm going to come out. I'll turn this on. So I'm. No, is this working? No.
Where's the
I think we have a battery problem.
We can't hear you now.
Keith, we'd be able to hear Keith.
Okay, so I'll just move around. Well, I'll go from table to table. Please keep your questions as brief as possible and your comments so we can at least get to each of the table for a comment.
Yeah, sure. Money and the results of that. Let me give an example. When I stood for Bristol West in England, England is still rather better at this, I was allowed to spend for my parliamentary election only £750, say $2,000. And if I spent more than that, or if anybody caused more than that to be spent on my behalf, I would be disqualified. Secondly, I did have the advantage, which I would recommend here. I had 60,000 constituents. The government, the post office, provided a free postage for one piece of paper to go to every one of my 60,000 constituents. And that was how I got my message across. I think something like that, but related perhaps to better in dollar terms, would be what I would like to see happen here.
Well, maybe you guys will take us back. You know, when I ran for Congress in 1976, when I was living down the peninsula, and I remember being just totally astounded at what you had to do as a candidate, which was spend all your time on the phone cold calling people asking for money. And this was in a campaign where we took a maximum donation of $20. This was the old days, but we couldn't even get in the door with that kind of money now. And everybody who serves, at least in the national government, spends all their time raising money, both during elections and between elections. And unfortunately, we have our Supreme Court, so we're going to have to figure out a way around those guys in order to bring money under control.
Do we have a question, Stan? And do you want to stand too, since we have the microphone is being fixed.
Clearly, democracy cannot work without a strong middle class. And what suggestions do you have as to how we reverse that process?
Well, it starts with tax the rich. It's no accident that the heyday of the American middle class came when Dwight Eisenhower was president, and the maximum tax rates were above 70%. That money got recycled through the rest of the economy. We also, in that period of time, had powerful labor unions who were able to keep the wage levels up and give working people perhaps their first opportunity in history to be middle class, to send their children to college, to own a home, to own a car. Needless to say, we've lost that. The labor unions are backpedaling now. But I think asserting control over that money to the extent that we make it clear that nobody gets wealthy on their own. All of us together have created the infrastructure that allows wealth to happen. And wealth has an obligation to pay back that infrastructure and an obligation to the rest of the society. And we don't want to take everybody's money or all of their money. We just want to take enough of it to keep the situation in hand. And I think that's, as long as you've got secretaries paying more taxes than their bosses, you're going to have this situation.
Okay, we've got a question over there.
I generally share your views about empire. How do you think the world and the United States should react to Rwanda 20 years ago, ISIS today, who are fascists, raping women, the Taliban, who don't let young girls go to school? And then second, related question, the 15-second attention span and the media firing, fueling all this hysteria. What's the chicken and the egg? Are they causing that, or are we causing that by watching that and paying attention?
Well, the last one first, both. But I can remember the point in time as a working journalist when I thought that began to happen. We suddenly, tabloid journalism made its way into the television world, and once it started, it just ran away with itself. I was covering a presidential campaign for the New York Times, and that's when Gary Hart got discovered out on his boat. At that point, all of a sudden, the herd swarmed, and the herd has been swarming ever since and doing as much as it can to hype whatever story comes its way, as opposed to bring some wisdom to it or some insight or whatever. And I blame the TV journalists for that more than anybody else. And certainly we're all dummies for paying attention to that. Now, as for our duties in empire, I'd take every case as by itself, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all in terms of responses. But we have to accept the fact that there are bad guys in the world. And there are more bad guys in the world than we have cures for any of the things that they're bringing to the table. In fact, our presence complicates that. I mean, there is no ISIS without our invasion of Iraq. And there's probably no ISIS without our willingness to attack them. And in terms of their capacity to recruit, the people that they recruit is directly proportional to their ability to point to us as their enemy. So I think we have to give up the thinking that somehow if we just stick our foot in, we can bring everything right. Nobody wants to see that kind of ugliness prevail. But bringing that kind of ugliness to heel is not a simple process. And we have used that as an excuse to get ourselves in circumstances where we had no business and no capacity to bring betterment to it. And so I think we have to pick and choose if we're going to make ourselves. I think Rwanda is a case where intervention would have been easy and limited. What we're doing now in Iraq and Syria is not. I mean, we've thrown ourselves in the middle of a civil war between the Sunnis and the Shiites, and we're going to get clobbered by both sides. And the end product is not going to be anything remotely resembling what we want to see there. And so, I think, sadly, we're not going to be able to fix everything out there with our army. I think the fixes are far more long-term in terms of how we relate to cultures. And the people we need to relate to in the world, we cannot do at gunpoint. And the message that we need to put across is not put across by sending some soldier to kick in your door with an M16. And noble as that may seem on the evening news, it does not give us what we need to bring to the situation. And we want to be on everybody's side. We want to be with victims wherever they are around the world and provide as much succor to them as we can. But we can't simply see that as a military operation.
All right, let's take another question as we keep moving around the room.
Yes, thank you for being here. And my question is about democracy and change in relationship to leadership. So excuse the metaphors, but can we expect our politicians to be wind vanes and compasses? Can they provide leadership and also respond? We saw some heel dragging, for example, on a green building program in our county. And we've got a long, long ways to go still. And we don't see leadership moving us forward, and we don't necessarily see the responsiveness we need either when we generate the need for change, or we identify the need for change.
My notion of leadership is that you be a compass. And the weather vane comes up every 2 years or every 4 years or whatever. And I want to see us have leaders who do what they think is best for the country, whatever the impact on their own political careers might be. And I think they get called to account quickly enough. But I think the rest of us ought to be compasses as well. The more we can create that political dynamic that points the way for the people who are going to lead us, the better off we're going to be. And my experience is that significant changes come off the bottom. They don't come out of the top. I mean, we succeeded in stopping the Vietnam War by virtue of changing the minds of citizens all around the country about what that enterprise was and our business being involved there. And that's what stopped the war. When that change happened, the politicians came right in line. All of a sudden the Democratic Party, who had started the war, decided they were going to finish the war too. And as a consequence, there was no war. But I don't think we should position ourselves as simply waiting for leadership to come up with what we need. I think as we identify stuff, we pursue it. And the more active the citizenry is, the better the democracy. Pure and simple.
Okay, we've got one more question at this table.
Hi again. Thank you very much for those 7 horriblenesses. I've seen them all here, I think, over time and way over time. My question concerns democracy is often equated with capitalism. We see that in the media, we see that in thought processes, and I know one's an economic system and one is a political system. But do you see any great way to tease those two apart? And this is a follow-up. I'm seeing the commodification, we're seeing the commodification of nature, the commodification of people as consumers versus citizens, the commodification of everything, which, is that a natural outgrowth of capitalism, or is there some other system? It's a very big, broad question, but thank you. And I'm looking for the elevator speech, so just to make it easy.
Well, you know, I think opportunity is part of democracy. And we always want to have a democracy where opportunity is available for everybody and their aspiration. I think that means not just enabling economic system, but also being willing to compensate for its excesses and control those. And I think that my issue is not with private ownership. My issue would be with the abuses that come along with the accumulation of capital. And I think as a body politic, I think that's the place that we intervene. We recognize that there are such abuses, and we take steps to compensate for them. And if that, you know, I don't know what that's called as an economic system, but I think it works if we're serious about it, and if the whole culture is. And you know, I look at the Scandinavian model, where you have cultures where in a country like Norway, they don't have to limit the income of the upper part of their bracket, because they live in a culture in which any executive who made more than 10 times what his workers owned would be considered a pariah. Their culture said, you know, has not allowed their accumulations of capital to get out of proportion, and obviously ours hasn't. I think that's where the political process can come to play and bring proportion back to the economy.
Okay, we've got a question here.
This is a statement I'd like to comment on and a question. I've always thought that if you want to understand a culture, you need to understand its values. And it seems to me that we were all brought up with the values to value freedom more than anything. As Americans, we're taught freedom is our core value. And it seems like somehow along the way that was evolved into power, because power really does look a lot like freedom on the surface, but it's different. We think that if you have power, you have freedom. And so instead of worshiping freedom, we're worshiping power now. And we live here and we live in Florida, so we're quite schizophrenic. And the interesting thing, and the reason I love Marin, is that our core values, I think, are freedom. In Florida, you tend to see it more being about power. So how do you feel about the evolution of our culture in that respect?
Well, I think, you know, you've identified a dynamic that we're always struggling with all of the time. I don't know that, I wouldn't just call it power, control is another, you know, that you are somehow free because of your capacity to control the circumstance, and the two are very different. And you know, what exactly freedom amounts to is one of those things that has puzzled philosophers forever. But I think without community and without the whole to which we cling that it's easy for freedom to run to power. You know, it's that compassion and humility that need to be built into the situation to keep freedom being about freedom. But once that humility is lost, and once that compassion no longer comes into play, there's little to restrain people from thinking that freedom means getting the best thing I can get. And freedom has to be something far more profound than that, and far more mutual than that. While, you know, we recognize individual liberties, I think that freedom is a commodity that has to be communal.
Okay, we're going to take 4 more questions. Clayton, Doris, and then over to this table, the 2 of you. So,
Yes, I would, is this on? Okay. I'd like, one thing I think I would like you to comment on, it refers to an article written by, I think, Michael Gleason in the Boston Globe recently. It's on the issue of what is called the deep state. And he referred to it in his essay on the subject as the double government, which has been in creation since the end of World War II and is embodied in our current NSA, the national security apparatus, and the fact that it may be now actually more in charge of our affairs, and that our elections are really now kind of just sort of a covering over, a kind of sanitizing of the fact that we really now are being governed by the deep state.
Well, without subscribing to the motives that you're attributing, you know, to the election, that it's an effort at sanitization. I think the fact is there is such a thing as that deep state that makes decisions every day that the rest of us have to pay for, and you know, not just financially either. And I think the capacity to control that is one of the great challenges that we've got, and where we have victimized ourselves. I mean, it's partly where this hysteria comes in. We have become so frightened that we've turned over protections that ought to have never been messed with, and given free rein to people whose allegiance is not to anything other than their own capacity to garner information. And I think as people, we have to be prepared to accept the risk of not being able to know what everybody else is thinking or talking about at any given time. And we have yet to find many compelling examples of where this deep state search for information has in fact served us well. You know, at least I don't see anybody coming up with proof that says, oh, because we have these powers, we are so much safer. You know, I'm of the school, I think Snowden's a hero. You know, I think it's sad that we live in a state where we have to count on somebody like him to tell us what our government is up to. But he did, and did us all a great service, I think, and ought to be treated accordingly. That the real enemy here is not Snowden. The real enemy here is the practices that he exposed. And I think that for us to seriously be able to counter that requires our willingness to stand up to the charge that we are somehow making ourselves vulnerable to the people who hate us.
Doris, your question?
My question was, I had 60 kids who were involved and like you were out on the street and doing things. We don't seem to have that. And most of these things do start with students. And I'm ready to go on the street, but I don't want to go alone. So my question is, how does one do this? How does one say, I've had enough, I want change? Yesterday, that's what they said, but it's such a strange result that they allow the Republicans to take over the Senate that I don't know. I think people are certainly angry, but what's the next move? How do we stand up and make a change?
Well, I think the answer is however you can. You know, I don't know that there's a recipe for the silver bullet that lets us do that. But I think I share your question of where are the students. I remember when we were marching against the Iraq War, being out there on Market Street, and remembering, you know, that in 1967 when we marched down Market Street, it was 85% people under the age of 26, maybe 95%. And being out there and looking around and saying, well, where are all the young people? You know, and I think that's a question, because they, you know, I'm waiting for them to rise up, and I think all we can say is that politics is talking to strangers, and that however we can talk to strangers, that that's the avenue towards change. I mean, it's not rocket science on that level. It's getting people to see things differently than they started out. And I think whatever mechanisms allow us to do that kind of persuasion are the mechanisms we should take. I think we should be guided always in that process with the understanding that means and ends are indistinguishable. You know, that forcing people, attacking people, hurting people is not going to yield anything but forcing, attacking, and hurting. It's not going to accomplish what we want. And certainly much of what could have happened in the 60s got derailed when people forgot that message. But the message is true, and I think citizens out talking to other citizens is the way out. And hopefully we'll find new and inventive ways to do that. And I've got to believe that the students are going to open up at some point. I mean, especially with climate change. They're the ones looking down the barrel on this. You know, most people in this room, at least judging by the demographics of the way you look.
Stop right there.
We're not going to see the worst of this. But our grandchildren sure are.
Okay, we're down to our final two questions.
Yes, hi. I'm not too sure if it's a question as in more of a comment. Welcome anyone's comments on it, but we're here to talk about democracy today. And when you take the situation of what's happening over with the Islamic State and our response to it, for those of us who, here in America, who have not exercised our right to vote, we are actually allowing something like the Islamic State to carry on the way that it is carrying on, because that's not at all a democratic type of response. And if we don't take our responsibility and use our democracy, our right to vote here, then that's one way that we are supporting them. The fact that right now we are bombing and killing everybody, Mr. Harris has said it several times, we have become what we are expecting through this convoluted manner of dealing with them. We have become the very thing that we are trying to so-called eradicate. And the democratic system is what we have here in hand. Everybody just has to use it. the way that I'm using it, and I'd like to put a plug in for an organization. It's called the Friends Committee on National Legislation, fcnl.org. They are a Quaker organization, but their advice, their plan of action, all of it is completely nonpartisan in any way, religious-wise or, democratic-wise. And they make it very easy to understand the situations, and they make recommendations on how to take your democratic ability and make a difference. They are connected. Everything that you put in with them is connected to our president, the senators, the representatives, everything.
Okay, so Laura, let's give
Okay,
David a chance to comment on that, and then we
Yeah,
have one final question,
just-
so I'd just like to move on.
Okay.
Thank you for the reference.
Just to finish it?
Thank you.
Well, here for the Friends. I think they have done good work ever since I've known them. And I think it's our responsibility as citizens to nurture democracy. We can't wait for somebody else to do this. And the degree to which we have become consumers of democracy rather than generators of democracy is the same track as the failures that our democracy has ended up with. So I think all of us have that responsibility, and we can't palm it off on anybody.
All right, Alan, you've got the final question.
And then we're going to do the drawing.
Thank you. It is, at least comes to my attention, that people are less and less inclined to vote now. And that the condition that we live under economically for most of this country is that it's good enough. And I wonder how you see the change coming. I mean, this last election, for example, the students didn't vote. The young people stayed away from it. And that's where the votes are. It looks like we have to, things must get much worse before people will get energized in this country.
Well, hopefully somebody out there is going to get serious about democracy and start generating that amongst the population, and the younger population included. I think we do have options, and we have to exercise all those options. And the excuse that, well, I'm not interested, doesn't cut it. I think all of us as citizens have the obligation to use the mechanisms that are available to us. And there's a lot more than elections. But to not participate in those is to invite the kind of minority governments that we end up being governed by. And also, it's important for all of us to recognize that this isn't a neutral playing ground. In this election and the election before it, and probably in the next election to come, it has been the policy of one party to try and limit the number of people voting to as small a number as possible. And it's been the policy of the other party to try and maximize people's participation. Without being partisan here in the nonpartisan group such as this, I have to say that I vote for maximum participation. That's not necessarily a cure-all, but it at least looks more like a democracy than making it absurdly difficult for people who are poor or to be disenfranchised. And that's what we're faced with. Thank you very much.